Hello there, MonoGame fans and solidarity brothers and sisters. Yes, I'm going to keep doing that for every single video. Anyway, here back for another session of the Darkside of MonoGame. This is the YouTube channel I've set up for putting all my MonoGame content up, so you can find everything we're doing from introductions to the last two sessions I've done, and we'll continue to do more going forward. So as we move forward now, there's been a lot of calls for having samples for things, so there is now, if you've not seen it before yet, there's the XNA Game Studio GitHub page, which basically has extracted every single one of the old XNA samples. So you can use this for MonoGame. And the idea here is that we're going to upgrade and maintain these for MonoGame going forward. The first one being, which is the subject for this session, is the new localization sample. In this session, we're going to go walk through what's in here. And there's a blog post which will also go through and detail exactly how to get started in a lot more detail. So I'm going to do a high level in the video. We're going to put steps and notes into the actual video itself so you can follow through and to cover everything you need to know. But the blog post goes into a lot more detail around this area. One thing that's also interesting to note is that this also has been extended, so not just to cover localization, but also to cover Japanese fonts and also WPF fonts from this article. If you can't actually read Japanese, then you can happily use Bing or Google Translate to be able to read this. But also note the fact that we're using the updated version of this, which you can see here, which the new Google Edge translation for actually working with translation. Try this if you're using Edge. Works very well. And it shows you the fact that it's having different style support for how you record these things and presenting fonts. So, back to this, and we shall get on with the actual tutorial. Okay, so we actually take a look at the sample, what we've got here, and go into the project. You can see here we've got a Windows project, a Linux project, just a few platforms, following the same patterns we did in the building multiple platform solutions in one of the last videos. And we've also got here two content pipeline extensions, and we'll walk through quickly the creation of this one. And this is also the WPF Font pipeline that we copied from the actual Japanese sample. However, this has been modified again still to make sure the fact that it works as a good extension in MonoGame, and also it's also consumed what we've done in this localization version so that it's a lot more powerful than what it was before. So we look in here, we've got resource strings, we've got some fonts and images in the content. And what happens here is that with this content all set up, using our pipelines, our game basically walks through loading the content, which is the same as what you expect. The XNA sample had a great thing here where they've actually created a specialized function here so that it only loaded the flag picture. And if we look at the flags we've got available here, so if I open up any of these pictures here, so you've got different flag images for all the different regions, and so it'll only load the specific one that is for the current culture the machine's logged on as. So it does this by basically getting the culture's name, going through what we've got, and then only loading in the one that we actually need for this current culture. So with that, it then goes and does some drawing where basically it's using the resource files here to gather out the welcome text, the current locale text, and the how to change. And then if you look in these resource files, you can see that these three definitions are here and how it pulls it out. And all this works very well, and if I run this, you get an example of what we get through the project. And this is all using the content pipeline to do this for us. So, because I'm in the UK, I'm getting the UK image, I've got UK text or English, and just basically I can adjust my system settings. I find it's better to use a simulator or a phone for changing the actual system culture, because changing in development environment, you then spend ages trying to undo it again, word-wise. And you can also see down the bottom as well the difference in using the WPF font renderer. of actually how we generate them using the actual Windows Presentation Foundation framework, and how that alters how the glyphs and the characters are generated from that font. So anyway, that's all the sample that's walking through. If you look in the actual sample folder, there's also a markdown file, README, which goes through all it is. A lot of this content's from the original XNA sample. A lot of it's been modified to make sure it reads right for how it presents, and also for MonoGame, so make sure it's all MonoGamified as well. Just to help you walk through and look into what it is, going through each of the different things and what it does. So that's the sample as it is in new. But if I want to do this new, so I'm trying to create a nice brand new content pipeline. I'm going to create a new project, and here I'm just going to do it straight out of the box, so no big projects and things. This is something like the way the article that accompanies this walks you through actually creating it. So I'm going to create my localization game. Let's get a new solution. It's in .NET Framework 4.5, and that gives me a nice blank project with nothing in here. And starting with the basics, working with the content pipeline itself. So if I open up the content project, I can right-click, add new item. Now, if your pipeline tool doesn't look exactly like this, I'm using the latest 3.6 development branch, and hopefully 3.6 will be out soon. There's a lot of heavy improvements in here from both a UX and a UI side for how this works, and no doubt it will still continue to improve as it gets close to release. Now I'm going to call this my, let's see, down. Okay, so I'm just creating a simple basic sprite. If I open this up, I can see the XML language that's used as part of both a XNA asset definition, but more specifically for a Sprite font. So in all XML definitions you create with XNA or with MonoGame, there's a standard terminology going through it, but I'll go through that in another one, another video, just because I'm trying to keep on target here. So for a Sprite font, we have an asset type, which is a graphics font description. So that's the MonoGame definition for what a font looks like. That includes its name, size, spacing. You can see the other properties down here, whether it's using kerning or not, what style it's using, the default character, and also the character regions as well, which specify what the starting and the ending character is that I should gather from this font. Now, I do highlight in the article as well, when you're generating font on a machine, it will only generate in the language that your development machine is currently running. So as I'm running English UK, I'm only going to get English UK characters. If I wanted to generate it for another language, then I'd have to set my language to that to generate the font for it. This is sometimes why developers will create assets with text in them. It's one way of doing it. It's not very flexible, and you're generally increasing the size of your entire game just because you want a different image inside a different text inside a different image. So if you can generate the text in the process and have it ready in the build in a much more smaller compressed format, it's a lot better. So looking at the actual XML definition here, we can see I've got the font Arial. Again, a key point here is that Arial font must be installed on this machine for it to build. If it's not installed, it's just going to error. One recommendation I always make is that if you're using a custom font in your project, save that TrueType font in your content folder. You don't have to register it in your actual content project, but have it there in the folder. That saves you having to, in case you lose it on your machine, you have to rebuild the machine. You give the project to someone else and then need to build and then haven't got the font. If you keep the fonts in with the content, then you'll always have a backup and a way to find a way to get that font working. Believe me, you do not want to spend hours or days trying to find a font file for something you created, or worse, one that you got an artist to create for you, they've now gone out of business and gone off somewhere else, and you've lost it. Then you have to like start all over again. So there's lots of parameters and things in here. That's all I really have to say about that. So if I then come back, if I close that, if I come back to here so that I can build it, oops, save it, then build it. There you go, there's my font's been built. And I come into my project and go into my game, and I'm simply going to say SpriteFont, my font. I then go to, as we did in pretty much every other video now, my font equals content dot load SpriteFont, making sure the fact that I get the name of my asset right. So I've got my basic Sprite font. Done. And then I simply just need a quick sprite batch. I've still got my snippet from the last time I did this. So, but instead of draw, I'm going to DrawString. And to do for this, then I simply need my font to tell you what my font is. I need some text, so my welcome message. I need to specify the position I'm going to draw it in, and I also need to provide a colour. And why wheat comes before white, I don't know, but there we go. So there we go. And then if I run this and save, and then run this now, there you can see now, in only a quick clicks, I've now got text drawing on my screen in Arial. It could have been any font I got on my machine, but in Arial, written on my screen. Fine, great. If you tried to do this manually, you'd have to generate a sprite sheet which has all the characters in it. I'd have to specify, create some logic to be picking out regions off that sprite sheet to then build the text along with correct spacings and everything else. MonoGame, and by virtue of X and A originally, did this all for you. There's a whole load of things that packages up inside of it to do it. But you know, it's still a very basic system, and you can always extend it however you wish, which is what we're going to do. Because one of the bad things you've got here is that I've now got a hard-coded piece of text in my game. If I want to take this now from, say, English and have it in Spanish, or running in French, or Korean, or Japanese, or wherever, then I have an issue, because that's hard-coded. Do I go and create a dictionary and work on what it is? It's still hard-coded in the game. Or do I do what I'm going to do now, where I'm going to rip that out, put it in a separate resource file, and then I'll simply refer to that resource. So how do we do this? I'm just going to add a new item to my project, which is a resource file. Thank goodness for search. There we go, I've got a resources file, and I'm going to call this strings. Just because that's how it is in the sample. Then, that's created it, and what it's done now is open up the resource dictionary for this project. Okay, so this means I can separate out all the text in my game. There are other things you can put in these projects, but to be honest, text is about the best way to do, is the best thing to just keep in these things. The others are useful, but not really any good. Okay, and the way this works is it's like a dictionary. So I'm creating a key called welcome. So that's the string I'm going to use in my project. I'm going to call it welcome, and I'm going to call this my localized project. There is an access modifier here, and this controls the code generation behind this string. So it's going to create some code behind this resource so that I can easily and quickly access the data that's in here without any complex logic. And they can be either internal or it can be public. On the most cases, you just need delivery internal. There's other options there, we'll come back to that. So that's set up in there. But what this now allows me to do, if I go back to my game, here, instead of my welcome message, I can now say strings, because that's the name of my resource file, dot welcome. And what that will do is now when that runs, instead of a hard-coded piece of text in there, it's pulling it from the resources file. Now the beauty of this is that a lot of translation or regionalization houses can use these resource files. You simply send them, and then they'll send you back loads of copies of the ones with your text translated. Bear in mind, you still have to pay per word or sometimes per file of how you work, so there's potentially a cost involved. Either that or ask a friend, but you give them the resources file. Fair enough. Now, that's fine, okay, but I'm still only in English. What if I actually want to go and actually do this in, say, French? So, to do this now, what we need to do is make a copy. And then I'm going to paste it back in of my strings resource file, right? And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a suffix to this with the language code. Now there are loads of these language codes, and if I call one up for you now, okay, and I'll drag this in, there we go. Okay, and here you can see there's a link in the article of all the different language codes you can work on. Now you'll see these are made up in two parts. There is a major part, which is basically the region or actual language it is in, and then there's a culture variant or a minor version to give it a more specific case, and you can create the resources as generic or as specialized as you want. If when the project's running it can't find a specific culture, it'll fall back to the generic culture. So if I have not got an Indian Sanskrit, sorry, a Sanskrit Indian variant, but I do have a Sanskrit, then it will use Sanskrit as a default. Same here with all the Spanish variants. So if I've not got a file which is basically es-ec, then it will look, but I have an es file, then it will use the es one. Simple as. But here we are, so I've got my French one in here, and what you also want to do is, because this is a language variant, not your main strings, you also want to turn off the code generation, because you only want one way to look at what the code is. And in here, so I've got my welcome key, and I'm going to say bonjour. Probably limit my French for the scope of this. I do know a bit more French than that, but I don't. Now, what the benefit here is that simply by doing this, by providing a culturalized version of my resource file with no code changing here at all, if I run this now in English, I will get English. If I ran this project in French, I'll get back my French string. And .NET does this for you out of the box, very simply, which is very good. So let's continue on. So here I've got theirs. Now one of the things we should do, and I highly recommend it, is we need to also set the natural language choice for our project, or the neutral language, I should say. And what this simply means is that if I don't have any resolution and don't know and don't have any language for what I'm going to look for, what do I fall back to? So what is this, the language of this? It's not strictly needed, but it is very useful. So that's that. Let's save and build that now. It's just something I recommend because it tells the build system exactly what you are. You won't get any other errors or complaints about how things are going to run. And that's it there. Okay, so finally we put a font into our project. We started drawing, and we've also looked about how to localize the project so we can have localized text and strings. But what if we don't do more? Because as I said, at the moment, if I build it, the only text I'm going to get in there is English, or the English variant of my font. So what if I want something a little bit more complex, or for different language? So if, for example, actually, right, one of the things we're looking at here, so what if I want Japanese to display in my project? To do this right now, I'd have to change the language of my machine to Japanese and then build the XMB again. But then again, then it's only for Japanese. So I've got a completely different version of my project for a completely different language, which is not ideal. So, in the XNA sample itself, it had added basically a content pipeline extension, and this is a good example because it's a nice warm-up or walking way to actually building extensions. To be able to interrogate these resource files, look at the strings or the characters that I need, and then just simply creating the actual character sheet that's going to be behind the font based upon the strings that I need. This has two big advantages. One, it only has the characters in I need, and two, I can also code with multiple languages straight in my files. So I don't need any complex build processes, it just works. Now, well, the main reasons why you'd actually want to build a content extension is to do things like creating normal, vertex, and tangent data out of a 3D model, taking those out, store them as separate arrays in the game at build time, not runtime, build time. You might want to say take a height map and build an array of the height values that are coming out of it, so you might use that for collision data. Alternatively, you might want to do things like taking the colours out of an image, building those into arrays so you can use them for like randomization data or something like that. There's loads of things you can do with these extensions above and beyond what the content pipeline does for the basic files themselves. But what we're going to do here is we're actually going to build an extension that extends our current SpriteFont implementation. And what that's going to do is allow us to be able to interrogate all of the resource files we've got, build up a character list, both in native and non-native characters, and then build a character sheet using all of those, which means our game is now fully translatable across all the regions, all the languages that we want to deploy on, and it's all contained in one project. The other benefit there as well is that, it's also compressed because we're only capturing those things we're going to use. Hence now the size of the assets behind this fonts are also smaller. So how do we do this? Here first we'll simply do is create a new content pipeline extension, making sure the fact that we're set to a .NET Framework 4.5 and we've got a nice template there already there for it. I'm going to call this my localization pipeline. Could call it my extension, but I'm not going to. Check on the properties of this, make sure everything's okay. You can see there it's currently .NET 4, so you need to change this to .NET 4.5, or else it simply won't build. The MonoGame libraries are all now in .NET 4.5, so you need to make sure your projects and everything else are updated to .NET 4.5. Good test is build it first, make sure it's okay. Now, one key thing is that in this project now, there's no reference between the game and the extension, because this is used by the content pipeline when you're building, so here, not by your game. There are other types of extensions where you might want to do a reference to it, but I'll cover those in the later sessions. Now, it comes with a content importer and processor by default. The importers are there to actually change how you read the data from the file, and the processes is how you work on that data to then output something else. Now, we're going to build our own, so we'll get rid of those. And what I want to create is a new font description first, which is a way of basically taking the existing SpriteFont class and I'm going to add on my own bits. So, okay, that's a little class file. Ta-da! Now what I want to do this first is I want to first inherit from the base MonoGame font description. I'm going to need to add a using statement using here because I'm coming from the MonoGame framework. What I want to do then is actually add a constructor for the base class. So I've got my localized font description constructor, but as I'm inheriting from font description, I also need to add a base constructor to that. Now don't worry about these values here, these are just defaults. Whatever you put into the file are what it actually will be used. So to this, what we need to add is the little bit extra we want. So we've got everything we get from font description. If I look at this, I can see I've got all the things we see in the actual XML, so what characters, spacing, size, font name, and so forth. And to this now, I'm also going to add a resource files definition. Again, I need another using to the content pipeline itself. You can see here that I've said it is optional. So if for perchance I give this a SpriteFont file that doesn't have this definition in, it's not going to break. I'm also saying that there's the collection that I'm adding into this thing for resource files will have a collection of resx files, and then that's all good. So now when I call this font file, I'm actually going to get an additional bit of information. So that describes what our new font type is going to look like. What we also then need to add is an actual processor. Now, processor is the part that's actually going to take the source file, do some work to then output what the content project needs as part of that extension. So I'm going to add another class. Let's walk through some of the bits that we have in this now. So in here, we need to do inherit from the content pipeline to tell the content processor that this is an actual content processor for us. More using statements, and another one. And what we're basically saying here, this is a content processor. It's going to take in a localized font description, the one we just created, and it's going to spit out a sprite font, effectively. Now so we're still using the same XNA or MonoGame sprite font output when we're doing this. Now it's red here because I don't actually have a class that's doing anything yet, but we'll come back to that. Now what we want to do is I'm going to throw another function in here, and this is going to do the work that we actually needed to do for this extension. It would do if it would paste in. And what this is going to do, this is actually going to do the work that we needed to do for the extension. Let's add a few more usings. And we also need file IO because we're actually going into the project and actually pulling out the resource files. So what this is going to do here is that it's going to take a font description as an input, so that's the actual file that the content project has read out. We're then going to go into that and look at this input resource files collection that we generated as part of that font description. Okay, so it's read the XML in, and it can see now it's got this additional collection. Then for each of them, we're going to get the file path out of it. Now we'll look at the file itself, what's in there. We'll basically get the path to the file where it is, make sure it exists. If it doesn't, then we're not going to throw a wobbler. We're just going to say, whoa, that's not going to work. And we're then going to load in the XML. And then for each element in that XML, we're going to, this is within the resource file itself, because these resource files at their core are XML files. And then we're going to loop through the characters in that to increase the characters that we want to put into our font output. Sounds a bit complex. On the top of it, it's quite easy. It's just basically, it's a case of telling it to open each of these that we tell it to, go in the XML, get all the characters out of it, and save them. And then when the content processor works on it, it's actually going to generate the font image, including those additional characters for us, without us having to change system values. Because obviously those characters do exist in the font file, but we can't access them unless we're in that culture. Okay, so the last things we need to do now is we need to actually add our process method. This is what's called by the content pipeline when it sees a content processor to actually go and process the input. And we're going to give it an input of our localized font description, our custom class, and it's going to take a context of the actual context engine, the processing engine as it's running. From there, we're actually going to call our special function then to add all the additional characters in that we need from our resource files, and then we're going to return back to the content processor the output to that, and then we're relying then on the standard process for building the font, and which is just going to take also the additional characters out of that font that we need, because obviously the font file itself still has those characters in it, we just can't normally get at it unless we've changed our region. And to finish this off now, we still need to be able to tell the content project that this is an actual content processor. So we do this by doing it with additional attribute on the class, which now in the content pipeline, when it reads this, knows it is a content processor. Now one, again, last little thing to do as well, it's more of a tips and tricks, is on the actual pipeline projects you've got, just build them for release. So no matter which way you build them, it's always built it the same way. Now the reason why this becomes important, if I build this, and then go into my content project itself, is that when we want to add a reference to our pipeline projects, we want to make sure it's always the same thing. And the way we do this is select project, select references, and then we want to find our pipeline, go to bin, and then we always want it in this release folder, so it's always the same thing. So if we're ever changing it, tweaking it, it's always going to be there and it's always going to work. Now, if you want to debug a pipeline extension, that's a little bit more tricky and a bit outside the scope of this tutorial, so I'll cover that in a future session. But for now, we're going to assume it always works, and it's always there. So let's then add a new sprite font now that uses this new definition. Now, there's a few things we need to do. Okay, so I'm going to create a new localized sprite font, and then I'm going to open that up, because at the moment this is actually using the standard MonoGame sprite font methods as we've done before. So same as our basic sprite font, doing the same one. So we need to change it, because we need this to be read as our new localized font description. That way the content process is going to pick it up and it's all going to work lovely. So to do this, we need to change the type. And a very big key thing here is that when you're changing the type of any asset, that you should use something customized, something that's not in the MonoGame framework, you have to specify both the namespace and the class name for the item you're doing. Doesn't matter where it is, if it's not in MonoGame, you have to specify the full path. So that's the namespace and the actual class name of the item or the asset you're going to use. Okay, now that we've made it one of our localized things, we actually need to be able to add in the additional information now that we've just specified in here. So we've got our resource files addition that we've added. So we need to add this into the XML so we can push it in. Now a key thing to note is, if we look at our processor here, this is getting in the resource files based upon a path. That path is relative to where the content is stored. So in this example here, the content is still in my project. So I need to walk back from my project to actually get to these string files here. So we go back at one and we go to the strings. In the sample on the GitHub page, it's a proper full multi-platform product. So these resource files are actually inside the content, so I don't need to specify this path. And then these resource files are then linked to the project instead of just in it. But for this sample, it's working relative, so it's just something to be aware of if something goes wrong. So that's fine. Let's save that and go back to our MonoGame project here. Now, as a trick here is that I always save and then I'll close and I shall reopen the actual content project. This just to make sure that any of these additional extension pipelines you got are actually loaded and everything's fine. I think future fixes will make sure the fact this might not be needed, but I'll probably still do it this way. And then what we want to do is now change the processor to use our new localized font processor that we've defined here. So we get it, and now because we've set it as a content processor, it'll appear in this list here as our localized font processor. By default, it uses the same class name. If you want, you can change this attribute so that it gives it a different name if you want it to. The documentation behind Framework Gold describes this, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just using the class name. That's there, and now if I go and build this, and there we go. It's now going to build my project. So what it's done now is imported this file, recognize that it's a font description class, so it's read in this additional information. It's passed it to the processor. Then in the processor, I've taken this, gone through all the resource files relative to where they are, pulled out all the extra characters, put it back into the actual process, and then told the framework to go and build it using all the additional information. And using this in game, you'd be surprised, is that because we're outputting just a sprite font, using it is exactly the same. So there's my sprite font. I'm going to load it exactly the same way. I'm going to check my name. Sneaky trick, let's just rename it to copy out the name. There we go. And then I'm going to copy this line for argument's sake, except I'm going to say it's my localized font. I'm going to put the same thing. Let's put this a bit way down. Vector 2, it's on X and down a bit. Oh no, there we go. Yeah, save and run. Now see, it looks exactly the same. If I wanted to, I could go and change the font and be slightly different, but because it's doing it this way, then you can pull in a lot more. And what I recommend doing is looking at this and then looking at the full sample that's on the XNA archive site and how that all works. Because there's a lot more in here. So if we go back to the actual localization sample, you can see there's a lot more strings in here. So I've got some Korean text, I've got some Japanese text, and these have all been pulled in from the font into the actual content pipeline and then are in my asset. And they were given additional characters so that when I'm drawing in these cultures, I can write text in these cultures. And it will just work. And I've not had to rebuild my project a lot of times and do things. Now, obviously, the sample itself also has this additional WPF Font pipeline, and I'll very briefly go through it. Or if you want, you can read it. We can see there's a lot more things in here now. So I've got the same localized font description because basically I've compiled these together so that I can do multiple cultures together instead of just Japanese. And then in here, the processor, there's a lot more. If I quickly nip down to the actual process method, oops, he says. And you look at this now, so this is a slightly more complicated processing method for how we extended the pipeline. So again, we get all the localized characters to make sure we can support whatever regions that we're going to deploy in. We're adding in additional characters, but this is for the WPF range, so it's actually working on additional characters that you might need for additional languages. It's also then going to use a method here called create WPF Font. And what this does is this generates customized GIFs or customized image as part of the process instead of actually just getting XNA to do it. We're then also processing them, so we're actually then writing out the actual new bitmap image with all the fonts and things in. Because you notice then we actually then just returning back straight away all of the work. We're not giving it back to the content processor to do more work. We've generated the sprite sheet here and also worked out all the font spacing, all the line spacing, and also what default characters are in there. So this is a lot more involved. Feel free to walk through it, and this simply gets out in different regions, as this shows here. Much more better stylized fonts. You don't have to use this for Japanese. If you want, as the sample does, you can use this with English or any other language. So running this, we can see that we've got more stylized text here, and I can adjust this and change this how I like, to change how that's generated, just to give different colors, different fonts. And it's just this is a very simple example of how to extend a package. I'll go through a few other different ways in different tutorials of being able to do this. We'll look at a custom model processor to be able to pull out model data and actually use that in the game. We'll look at also pulling out different XML files in our content and how they can work. There's a huge amount of power in here. It takes a bit of thought to get used to, but you can get a lot out of it. So that's the localization sample. Apologies, as has been a very long session, but it's a very deep area, and this is literally a 1,000-foot view of all the capability options that are in here and what you can do. Also, you can use this sample and just throw it into your project to give you extra processing. It will all work, and you can change it how you wish. So that's been me. This has been the Content Pipeline, and I wish you happy gaming solutions. And as ever, solidarity everyone, and on with the show.